The tray of champagne flutes hit the marble floor of my mother's foyer before she finished pretending she didn't know my name. "I'm sorry," Marguerite Ashcombe said, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe of the funeral home. She'd spent 30 years turning into the most respected address in Millhaven Falls, Ohio. "Who?" Colonel Desmond Pike stood on the porch in his dress blues, ribbons catching the porch light, a leather folio tucked under one arm like he'd rehearsed the whole exchange on the drive over. He wasn't rattled easily. I'd watched the man call in a medevac while taking small arms fire without his voice changing pitch. But something about my mother's face made him repeat himself slower, the way you do for someone who might be in shock. "Captain Ran Ashcombe, ma'am, your daughter." I flew in from Fort Colby. I tried calling ahead, but the number on file didn't connect. "I'm here about the Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony. Army protocol requires in-person notification to listed next of kin when a decoration of that level is being awarded, and this address is what's on her file." Ashcombe Family Funeral Home had stood on the corner of Corbett Street and Willow Lane for 106 years, trusted by generations of Millhaven Falls families in their worst hour. My great-grandfather built the business on a simple promise my mother still recited at every gala like scripture, that grief deserved dignity, and dignity deserved to be affordable. It was, I would come to understand over the following weeks, a beautiful promise sitting directly on top of a rot that had been eating through its foundation for 14 years. 40 guests in cocktail attire had gone quiet behind her, wine glasses suspended halfway to their mouths, the string quartet in the corner sawing to a ragged stop mid-phrase. It was the Millhaven Falls Hospice Support Gala, an event my mother hosted every September in the viewing room, turned ballroom of Ashcombe Family Funeral Home, complete with candlelight, a silent auction, and a banner that read "Compassion in Every Season" in gold cursive above the fireplace. My mother had built her entire public identity on being the woman this town trusted with its grief. And standing in her doorway was a full colonel in dress uniform, asking for a daughter she had spent 14 years telling people had vanished. A caterer's tray went down somewhere behind her. Not the champagne flutes this time, a second one, silver hitting stone canapa, pays scattering across the floor. My mother had polished that morning specifically so it would shine for people who mattered. Nobody moved to pick it up. The silence stretched long enough that I could imagine it from 300 miles away. My mother's face, doing the thing it always did when she needed a story faster than the truth could arrive. "I think there's been some confusion," she said finally, recovering the way she recovered from everything. Smoothly, with a hostess's smile stitched back into place a half-second too late to be convincing. "It's a complicated family situation, Colonel. Why don't you come through to the study?" She had her hand on his elbow before he could answer, steering him past the gala guests like he was a delivery she needed to sign for quickly and quietly. But not everyone in that room let it go that easily. Faye Radnor, my brother, Holt's wife, a woman who had spent 11 years married into this family, without ever once hearing a straight answer about anything, stood near the dessert table with a plate of lemon tarts balanced on 2 fingers, watching my mother's retreating back. She said one word, so quietly it barely left her mouth, but Sable Griggs told me afterward that 3 people heard it. "Vanished." Not the way my mother always said it, flat and final like a door closing. Faye said it like a question. Like she was trying the word on for the first time and finding it didn't fit anything she actually knew. In the study, Pike told me later, my mother poured him a whiskey he didn't ask for and talked in circles about young people needing space, never quite answering why my personnel file still listed this address as my only emergency contact. She changed the subject to ceremony logistics, and Pike left with more questions than he'd arrived with, which was exactly what made him pick up the phone and call me directly. She'd heard the word "vanished" applied to me at every gala for 11 years, always followed by my mother's hand pressed briefly to her own collarbone, a gesture of manufactured sorrow guests had learned to receive with sympathetic murmurs and no follow-up questions. But a colonel standing on the porch in dress blues, asking for a woman by rank and full name, was not a detail anyone could politely let pass. A person who has actually vanished doesn't have a rank. A person who has actually vanished doesn't get nominated for the Distinguished Flying Cross. I wasn't there for any of it. I was 280 miles away at Fort Colby, running post-flight checks on a Black Hawk after a night training rotation, when my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I recognized as Colonel Pike's personal line. It was 9:52 p.m. I didn't listen to it until almost 11, exhausted, sitting on the tailgate of a Humvee with my helmet still under one arm. It was the kind of night that used to be the whole of my life, back when I first left Millhaven Falls. Nothing behind me but a rearview mirror and a checklist. Nothing ahead but the next approach, the next qualification, the next reason to keep my hands too full to think about a house 300 miles east that had stopped being mine. 12 years of that particular arithmetic had worked well enough that I'd almost convinced myself I didn't need to solve for the variable I'd left unaddressed. Almost. Ashcombe, it's Pike. I went out to notify your family about the ceremony like protocol requires, and I have to be honest with you. Your mother looked at me like I'd said something in a language she didn't speak. Like she'd seen a ghost. I don't need the whole story, but if there's something I should know before the award goes public, tell me now. I sat there in the dark for a long time before I called him back. She didn't recognize the name, I told him, because as far as she's told this entire town for the last 14 years, I don't have one anymore. I didn't vanish, sir. I was told never to come back. There's a difference, even if nobody in that house ever bothered to explain which one it actually was. He didn't ask why. That was the thing about Pike. He'd flown enough medevac missions to know that some wounds don't need narrating in the moment, only tending to. He just said, take the leave. Whatever this is, you should be the one standing in that room when it gets sorted out, not me. I hung up and sat there on that tailgate for a long time, watching a maintenance crew tow a Chinook back into its hangar under floodlights. I thought about the version of this story I'd told myself for over a decade. The one where I'd simply outgrown a small town and a difficult mother, where staying away was a choice I'd made rather than a sentence I'd been handed. I had built an entire adult life on the unspoken agreement that I would not go looking for a door that had already been shut in my face, and now the door had come looking for me instead, delivered by a man in dress blues who had no idea what he'd just knocked loose. I sat with the question that had been sitting under my ribs for 14 years, the one I'd never let myself ask out loud, because I already knew the shape of the answer I was afraid of. If the family that erased you finally needed you to show your face again, would you still walk back through that door? Comment Y if yes. Comment N if no. I'll tell you the truth by the end. I requested emergency leave the next morning. The first time in 12 years of service I had ever asked for anything outside a training calendar. My battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel named Rhea Alden, who'd flown 2 rotations with me, and knew me well enough to recognize when something outside the ordinary had cracked through my usual composure, read the leave request form without asking a single question, signed it, and slid it back across her desk. You've banked 91 days of leave you've never touched, Ashcombe, she said. Take what you need. The unit will manage without you for a week. It was, as I understood even then, an unusual kindness dressed up as routine administration. The kind of thing that happens when the people around you can see on your face that you already know this is going to cost you something no amount of leave time can buy back. I told myself I was going home to correct a paperwork error, to explain to Colonel Pike's satisfaction that my mother had simply misspoken under pressure. I did not let myself think further than that, because further than that was a version of the truth I hadn't looked directly at since I was 20 years old. Millhaven Falls hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. The same brick storefronts along Corbett Street, the same water tower with Ashcombe, painted faintly beneath a newer coat that hadn't quite covered it because my great-grandfather had donated the paint job back when the funeral home was the only business in town that could afford to. I drove past the elementary school, where Sable and I used to trade lunches, past the Baptist church, whose bell I could still set my watch to, past the turnoff to the county airfield where I'd taken my very first flight lesson at 16, in a borrowed Cessna, my father in the right seat, 3 years before the cancer took him, and 2 years before I understood how completely his death had left my mother alone to run both a business and a family she'd never wanted to manage by herself. I used to think that was the beginning of everything that went wrong. I know now it was only the beginning of everything that got easier to hide. My father had been the one who taught both Holt and me to fly, in his own quiet way. Holt in the family sense, riding along on hunting trips in a puddle jumper he kept at the county strip, and me in the sense that actually stuck. Hours logged in that borrowed Cessna, until I had enough to apply for the flight program that eventually became my entire career. I wondered, driving past that airfield with 14 years of distance behind me, what he would have made of the man his son became, and what he would have made of the wife who'd spent a decade telling their daughter's absence as a cautionary tale instead of the truth. I did, somewhere around the second stoplight on Corbett Street, that I didn't actually need to know the answer. Some questions you carry out of love rather than necessity. And that one, I let go before I reached the driveway. I parked my rental car in the circular drive I used to ride my bike around as a kid, gravel crunching under tires the way it always had, and I stood there for 4 full minutes before I made myself walk up to the door. Through the front windows I could see the tail end of the gala's cleanup, folding chairs being stacked, the last of the candle centerpieces being blown out one by one, my mother's silhouette, moving through the emptying rooms with the particular brisk energy of a woman, putting a disaster back in its box before anyone could examine the contents too closely. My mother opened it before I could knock, already performing relief with both hands pressed to her chest like something out of a stage play. "Thank God you're safe," she said, pulling me into an embrace so convincing that a stranger watching from the street would have wept for her. Her perfume was the same one she'd worn my entire childhood, and for one disorienting second my body responded the way a body does to 20 years of muscle memory, softening into her before my mind caught up and reminded the rest of me exactly what I was standing in the middle of. As though I were the one who had disappeared into the woods once one night, without a trace. As though I hadn't spent 14 years exactly where the United States Army could locate me at any hour of any day, while she was the one who couldn't be bothered to update a mailing address. "You must be exhausted from the drive," she said, already moving, already narrating, ushering me through the foyer with a hand at the small of my back, the way she used to steer clients through the selection room, gentle and practiced and entirely about controlling where my eyes landed next. "Let me show you where you'll be staying. I've had the guest suite made up." She walked me through the house like a realtor showing a property, and every room confirmed what Pike's confusion had already told me. My old bedroom had been repainted a soft gray and rebranded a guest suite, with a folded quilt and a bowl of decorative soap shaped like seashells sitting where my track trophies used to be. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking for anything of mine that had survived the renovation. A scuff on the closet door where I used to hang my flight school acceptance letter. A pencil mark on the frame where my father had measured my height every birthday until I was 14. And found nothing. Even the pencil marks had been sanded and repainted over, which meant at some point my mother had stood in this room with a can of paint and made a deliberate decision to erase a decade of small proof that a child had grown up inside these walls. "It's lovely, isn't it?" she said, misreading my silence as approval, smoothing a hand over the quilt. "I redid it the year after you left. It seems silly to keep a room frozen like a shrine." The hallway gallery, the one my mother updated religiously every Christmas with new frames, had exactly 0 photographs of me in it, going back at least 14 years, replaced seamlessly by pictures of Holt's wedding, Holt's promotion at the funeral home, Holt and Faye's anniversary trip to the Outer Banks, a studio portrait of my mother alone in a burgundy blazer that I recognized as the same one she'd worn on the funeral home's website for as long as it had existed. I counted the frames twice out of some stubborn, childish hope that I'd miscounted the first time. I hadn't. Even the small side table beneath the gallery, the one that used to hold a dish of butterscotch candy my father kept stocked for visiting children, had been replaced with a narrow console displaying funeral home brochures fanned out in a precise arc, as though the entire hallway had been quietly repurposed from a family's memory into a showroom. When she took me out to the family plot behind Ashcombe Family Funeral Home to show a group of gala stragglers the newly restored headstones, still lingering on the lawn with half-finished drinks, she rattled off 3 generations of family history to a woman in a sequined dress. My great-grandfather who founded the business, my father who expanded it, Holt who would one day inherit it, and my name did not appear once, not even as a footnote, not even as the daughter who used to exist. The woman in sequins nodded politely. The way you nod at any recitation of a family tree that isn't your own, with no idea she was standing on the exact spot where an entire branch had been quietly sawed off. But it was the portrait in the foyer that stopped me longest. The large formal family photograph that had hung over the entry table for as long as I could remember, the one every mourner walking into a viewing had to pass beneath. I had been in that photograph once. I remembered the sitting, remembered the photographer telling me to stop fidgeting with the hem of my dress. Now the frame held a different composition entirely. My mother and Holt alone, centered, a decorative urn of dried hydrangeas positioned exactly where I used to stand, as if the florist had been hired specifically to fill the negative space where a daughter used to be. If you looked closely at the very edge of the backdrop, there was a faint shadow of retouching along the wallpaper pattern, a seam where someone had stitched two versions of reality together and hoped nobody would look hard enough to notice the thread. I noticed. I've flown enough low-visibility approaches to know exactly what it looks like when something's been altered, just enough to pass a glance but not a real inspection. I didn't say anything to my mother about the portrait that first night. I went instead to the one place in Millhaven Falls I trusted more than my own childhood home. The flower shop on Corbett Street with Griggs Juice and Bloom painted in green above the window, where Sable Griggs had been arranging peonies since she was old enough to hold shears. We'd been inseparable from the second grade until the summer I left. Two girls who used to ride bikes to the county airfield together to watch crop dusters take off, who used to sneak into the funeral home's chapel after hours to practice harmonies for the middle school talent show, because the acoustics were unbeatable and nobody ever thought to check whether the building was actually empty. Sable didn't ask why I'd stayed away so long. She just wrapped both arms around me in the doorway of her shop and held on until the bell over the door stopped ringing, tears running freely down her face, in a way that told me, more clearly than any explanation could have, exactly how long she'd been carrying the weight of not knowing what had actually happened to me. I used to tell people you were a helicopter pilot, and they'd laugh, like I was making it up, she said into my shoulder, half laughing and half crying at once. Nobody believed me because your own mother told a completely different story to the exact same people. She pulled back, wiped her face with the heel of one hand, and disappeared into the back room. She came out with a shoebox that had seashell sandals, size 7 printed on the side in faded marker, long since repurposed for something that had nothing to do with shoes, and set it on the little bistro table between us like it weighed more than cardboard should. Inside were 41 letters, every one of them addressed in my own handwriting to my mother's house, every one of them returned, unopened, to Sable's family address instead. A clerical accident, or so it had looked for years, since Sable's childhood home sat 2 doors down from mine, and an inattentive mail carrier could plausibly have confused the two. Beneath the letters, wrapped in a dish towel, was a 5x7 print of the original family photograph. The real one. The one with all 4 of us in it. The one that used to hang in that foyer before somebody decided a daughter was an inconvenient detail in an otherwise flattering composition. I had given Sable a copy the year it was taken, for no reason beyond the fact that we were 15 and she'd asked, and it had sat forgotten in a box for nearly 2 decades, while a doctored version of the same image greeted mourners in my mother's house. I tried to bring a few of these back myself, Sable admitted, sitting across from me at the little bistro table she kept by the window, her voice dropping into something careful. Maybe 6 years ago. I'd found 3 of your letters mixed in with old holiday cards while I was cleaning out a closet, and I thought, enough is enough. This is ridiculous. She deserves to know her own daughter is trying to reach her. So I walked right up to your mother's door with 3 of them in my hand, and she met me on the porch before I even got to the bell, like she'd seen her from the kitchen window and timed it. She told me, very calmly, like she was reciting a policy she'd said 100 times before. Ren isn't part of this family's business anymore, Sable, and neither is anything addressed to her. Then she took the letters out of my hand, thanked me for my concern in that voice she uses for clients who are being difficult about a casket upgrade, and told me she'd see they were forwarded. I never found out where they actually went. I stood on that porch feeling like I'd been handled instead of heard, and I stopped trying after that. I'm sorry. I should have tried harder. I should have driven 300 miles and found you myself, instead of trusting her to do one decent thing. You tried when nobody else did, I told her, and meant it. That's not nothing, Sable. That's the opposite of nothing. We sat with the shoebox between us while the afternoon light moved slowly across the shop floor. And for a while neither of us said anything about the funeral home at all. She told me about the years I'd missed instead, her divorce, quiet and amicable, from a man she'd married too young and outgrown by 30, the way she'd built Griggs and Bloom up from a single leased storefront into the only florist within 20 miles that could handle a full wedding order on 4 days' notice. A nephew she adored, who'd started calling her Aunt Sable, even though there was no blood relation to justify it, just 14 years of showing up. It struck me, listening to her, that she had built an entire life in this town my mother had turned into a place I couldn't safely stand in, and that some part of me had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that Millhaven Falls itself had rejected me rather than one specific, powerful woman inside it who controlled which version of the truth got repeated at every gala. I never stopped believing you, Sable said quietly, near the end tucking the shoebox lid back into place like she was closing something sacred. I just didn't know how to prove it to anyone who mattered. I'm glad you finally get the chance to. It wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. My mother hadn't simply failed to forward 41 letters over 14 years through bureaucratic carelessness. She had intercepted them, actively, deliberately, standing on her own porch, turning away a woman who loved me enough to try. I had spent over a decade telling myself the story I could live with, the gentler one where my mother was merely weak, merely embarrassed, merely unwilling to fight for a daughter who'd made her life complicated. The version where Sable stood on that porch and got turned away by name was not that story. That was a woman actively guarding a wall, brick by brick, for 14 consecutive years. I confronted my mother about it directly that evening, in the same study where she'd once ushered Colonel Pike away from prying ears. I didn't lead with the letters. I led with the question I'd never gotten a real answer to at 20 years old. Why was I really pushed out of this house? She reached for the old grievances the way other people reach for a coat on a cold night. Automatic, well-worn, exactly where she'd left them. My temper, my choices. That summer I'd come home from flight training unstable, she said, using a word that had never once described the daughter Sable's 41 letters had described in careful, patient handwriting for 14 years. You were always so hard on this family, Wren. So quick to judge people who were doing their best. I let it go on longer than I should have, and eventually I had to protect this house from that kind of temperament. I have 41 letters in a shoebox that say otherwise, I said. Written by the daughter you're describing. You want to tell me which version is the lie, Mom? Because I've read every one of them twice since yesterday, and not one of them sounds unstable. They sound like someone who kept trying. You don't understand what running a business like this requires, she said, her composure fraying at the edges now, a brittleness creeping into her voice that I'd never once heard directed at me before, only at difficult vendors and clients who questioned an invoice. Every choice I've made in this house, I made to protect something bigger than one person's feelings. You were 20 years old. You didn't understand what exposing your brother would have cost this family. The business, the town's trust, everything 3 generations built. I made a decision that summer. I'm not going to apologize for it just because it's inconvenient for you now. You made a decision to let 31 families keep paying into an account you knew was being robbed, I said. That's not protecting the family business, Mom. That's just theft with better public relations. Her jaw tightened. The first genuine crack I'd seen since Pike's visit. Not guilt, exactly. More like the particular irritation of a woman watching a story she'd curated for 14 years get interrupted by evidence she hadn't accounted for. None of it lined up. None of it had ever lined up, and some part of me had known that since I was 20 and had simply been too tired, too far away, too busy building a career 300 miles from her voice to keep arguing with a woman who'd already decided which version of me she was going to tell people about. Holt walked in halfway through, drawn by raised voices the way he always used to be as a kid, hovering in doorways to see how bad a fight was going to get before deciding whether to stay. He looked older than 38 should look. Gray, coming in early at the temples, an unhealthy softness under his eyes, a tremor in his hand when he reached for the glass of scotch already sitting on the study's side table, like he'd anticipated needing it before the conversation had even started. I remembered him at 24, the older brother who'd taught me to drive stick in the funeral home's parking lot on Sunday mornings before services. Patient and funny, in a way that made the years between us feel smaller than they were. I looked for that version of him in the man standing in the doorway and couldn't find much of him left. "What's this actually about?" he said, trying for casual and landing somewhere closer to cornered. "The trust accounts," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It came out of somewhere underneath 14 years of carefully constructed forgetting, and the second it left my mouth, I watched my brother's face do something I hadn't seen since we were kids, and he'd been caught taking money from our father's dresser drawer. A full-body flinch, quick and involuntary, gone almost as fast as it arrived, replaced by a laugh that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, and left the room before I'd even finished the sentence, before my mother had said a single word in his defense, before anyone had explained anything at all. He just left, fast, the way you leave a building when you can already smell the smoke. And standing there in that study, watching the door swing shut behind him, I finally let myself remember, in full, the thing I'd spent 14 years training myself not to. I was 20 years old, home for the summer between flight school modules, helping Emmett Truro reconcile the funeral home's books because our regular part-time bookkeeper had gone on maternity leave, and my mother trusted family with the ledgers more than she trusted strangers. I remembered the exact afternoon. The office fan clicking on its oscillation, Emmett two desks over sorting invoices, sunlight cutting a hard line across the ledger pages while I cross-referenced trust deposits against client files, a task I'd volunteered for because it felt useful, and because, at 20, I still believed usefulness was the fastest way to earn my mother's approval. I'd found withdrawals from client pre-need trust accounts, the specific sacred fund families paid into years in advance so their own funerals would be covered without burdening their grieving children. Money that legally could not be touched for anything but its intended purpose, routed instead into a personal checking account that traced back to Holt. One withdrawal was for $9,450, pulled from an elderly client named Bertram Okafor's trust account 11 months before Mr. Okafor actually died, money meant to cover a modest service and burial that his family would later have to scrape together themselves, because the funds they'd already paid for weren't there anymore. I'd shown my mother the discrepancy on a Tuesday afternoon, spreading the printouts across this exact desk, certain she would be as horrified as I was. I remembered exactly how I'd phrased it, naive enough at 20 to think facts alone would be sufficient. "Mom, look at this. This is Mr. Okafor's trust. This is Holt's account number right here. This isn't a bookkeeping error. This is theft from a dying man." She had looked at the printouts for a long moment, then looked at me and told me, in a voice I still remember as perfectly calm, to forget I had ever seen it. "You don't understand what you're looking at," she'd said. "This family has survived 100 years on discretion, Wren. You will not be the generation that ends that." I remember the particular quality of the silence that followed. The office fan ticking through its slow rotation, my mother's hands perfectly still on the desk while mine were shaking. And how certain I'd been in that moment that I'd simply explained it badly, that if I just found better words she would understand what I already understood, that a man's dying wife had trusted us with the last thing she had left to give him, and we were about to fail her. And I refused. When I said I was going to report it, that these were dead people's families being robbed of the money they'd trusted us to protect, she didn't argue the ethics of it with me at all. She simply changed the subject entirely, 3 days later into a story about an unstable daughter who'd stolen from the family and needed to leave before she caused any more damage. I remembered standing in this same doorway, hearing her tell it to my father's sister over the phone, her voice pitched for an audience, and realizing with a kind of vertigo I'd never fully recovered from that she wasn't describing me at all. She was describing a decoy, built specifically to survive the scrutiny I'd almost brought down on Holt. I was gone within the week, my things boxed up and left on the porch, my name quietly removed from every conversation that followed. The shameful disappearance my mother told 40 guests about at every gala since had never been about me leaving at all. It was cover, meticulously maintained for 14 years, for the exact moment I had almost exposed my own brother. And it had worked so well that even I had spent a decade half believing I was the one who'd done something unforgivable. I went to see Emmett Truro the next morning. He still kept his accounting office 2 blocks from the funeral home. The same brass nameplate on the door, the same green banker's lamp on the same oak desk, and the same nervous habit of straightening papers that were already straight when someone asked him a question he didn't want to answer. He'd done my father's taxes, and his father's before that, and there had been a version of my childhood where Emmett Truro felt less like an employee and more like an uncle who happened to be very good with numbers. Told him I was doing some informal estate planning and needed to look at old trust documentation. A lie thin enough that a 66-year-old accountant who'd known me since I was in diapers saw through it before I'd finished the sentence. Ren, I can't just hand over client files because you asked nicely, he said, not unkindly, sliding his glasses up his nose and reaching for a stack of invoices to reorganize, the same nervous tell I remembered from childhood. You know that. Your mother would have my license. He stonewalled me anyway, citing client confidentiality, right up until I said the exact account number I'd memorized 14 years earlier without ever meaning to. 4471B, Bertram Okafor's trust, a number no outsider, no estranged daughter with nothing but a grudge, should have had any business still carrying around in her head after all this time. I watched it land. His hands stopped moving entirely. How do you know that number, he said, very quietly, and I understood in that instant that he already knew exactly how I knew it, that some part of him had been waiting 14 years for someone to finally say it out loud in his office. Emmett's composure didn't crack all at once. It came apart the way old plaster does, in a long, slow fracture that started at his jaw and worked down through his shoulders until he was sitting very still, with both hands flat on the desk, staring at them like they belonged to someone else. He got up without a word and locked the office door, then pulled a second, unlabeled ledger from the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet I remembered him keeping locked even when I was a kid. The drawer he used to joke held nothing more interesting than old receipts, a joke I'd never questioned until this exact moment. The corrections never stopped, he said quietly, sliding the ledger across the desk toward me with the resigned motion of a man setting to something he'd been carrying too long. After you left, I told myself it was a one-time thing, that your leaving would scare Holt straight, that your mother would make sure it never happened again. I told myself that for years, Ren, because it let me keep coming to this office every morning and doing my job. It didn't stop. It just got better at hiding. Smaller withdrawals spread across more accounts, replenished faster so nothing ever sat uncovered long enough to trip an audit. There are entries in that ledger going back only 8 months, not 14 years ago. 8 months. They're still doing it right now, to families who buried someone last spring. I turned the pages slowly, my own hands unsteady in a way they never were at altitude, and found initials I recognized from gala guest lists, from church bulletins, from people who'd sat 2 pews over from my family every Sunday of my childhood. Every single one of them a name attached to a trust account that had been quietly, systematically bled for 14 straight years. The office fan clicked on its oscillation, the same way it had 14 years earlier, and for a moment I was 20 again, sitting at that same oak desk with printouts spread in front of me, except this time nobody was going to tell me to forget I'd seen it. This time I had a state investigator's business card in my jacket pocket, and no intention of putting it away. I want copies of every page, I told Emmett. Tonight, if you can manage it. And then I want you to call the number on this card and tell them exactly what you just told me. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd walked into his office, he looked less like a man protecting a secret and more like a man finally setting one down. I sat in my rental car outside his office for a long time after that. Engine off, hands on the wheel like I was flying an approach through weather I couldn't see the bottom of. Everything I had built my understanding of this family around for 14 years had just shifted underneath me in a single sentence. Owens, this wasn't a wound from my 20s that had finally scarred over. It was an active, ongoing theft, ticking forward in real time. And somewhere in Millhaven Falls right now there was a grieving family writing a check to Ashcombe Family Funeral Home, trusting my mother's polished hands with the last thing they had left to give someone they loved. with no idea that the money might never actually be there when they needed it. I understood, finally, in a way I hadn't let myself understand at 20, exactly how far my family was willing to go, and exactly how little I actually knew about the size of what they'd built out of my absence. For 14 years, I had told myself a survivable version of what happened. A single bad summer, one ugly decision, a wound that had scarred over the way wounds do. What Emmett had just handed me was not a scar. It was an open, ongoing wound, still bleeding into 30-something families I hadn't even met yet. Families who had no idea that the woman handling their grief with such practiced, gentle competence was standing on top of a foundation she'd been quietly hollowing out since before I left home. I had thought I already understood the worst of it, sitting in that study confronting a mother who wouldn't meet my eyes. I had no idea I was still only halfway through the story. Faye found me 2 days later, waiting by my rental car outside Griggs and Bloom with a folder pressed flat against her chest, like she was smuggling something out of the house. I barely knew her. In truth, she'd married into this family 2 years after I'd been erased from it, which meant every memory she had of me was secondhand, filtered through whatever version my mother had told her at Thanksgivings I'd never attended. She looked nervous in a way that had nothing to do with me personally, and everything to do with what she was about to hand over. I almost didn't come, she admitted, glancing back toward the street like she expected to be followed. 11 years married to Holt, and she said she'd learned to read her husband's moods the way sailors read weather. The tight jaw before a late-night phone call, the sudden generosity after a bad one, a lifestyle that always looked one renovation ahead of what a small funeral home's income should reasonably support. New truck 2 years ago. A kitchen remodel last spring. A boat he used exactly twice before it sat under a tarp in the driveway, and every time she'd asked how they could afford it, he'd said the business was doing better than people think, delivered with a tightness around his eyes she'd learned not to push against. I need to know something, she said, not quite meeting my eyes, and I need you to be honest with me even if it's ugly. Do the money problems go back further than our marriage? Because 3 weeks ago Holt asked me to co-sign a loan against the funeral home itself, full collateral. He told me it was a routine equipment upgrade, new embalming machinery, something boring. I signed it because I trusted him. But I've been the one balancing our household accounts for 11 years, and the numbers on that loan don't match anything boring. And if what I'm starting to think is true, that building was never fully his to put up as collateral in the first place. Not if it belongs to trust clients who are dead. I told her everything. Emmett's ledger, the 8-month-old entries, Bertram Okafor's name printed in a column he never should have appeared in. Watching her hear it, watching 11 years of a marriage she'd believed in reorganize itself in real time across her face, each new detail landing like a small, precise blow, was its own particular kind of grief, one I hadn't expected to feel on someone else's behalf. She sat very still through most of it, and when I finished, she opened the folder she'd been holding and turned it toward me. Inside was a copy of the loan paperwork, her own signature notarized beside Holt's. The funeral home listed as collateral in language dense enough that I doubted either of them had read it closely before signing. I co-signed this because he told me it was routine, she said. Her voice steady in a way I suspected was costing her considerable effort. I have a daughter in community college I'm trying to help pay for. If this house loses everything because of what he did, I lose everything too, and so does she. I need you to understand that whatever I decide to do with this, it isn't loyalty to him keeping me quiet. It never really was. I asked her, as gently as I could, why she'd stayed married to him this long if she'd already sensed something was wrong for years. She thought about it, for a long moment before answering, turning her wedding ring once around her finger, the way people do when they're deciding how honest to be. Because suspecting something and proving it are two very different weights to carry, she said. I told myself it was gambling debt from before we married, something old and finished, not something still happening under my own roof. It's easier to stay married to a man you think made one bad mistake a long time ago than to a man who's still making it. I think some part of me knew which one was actually true, and chose not to look too closely, because looking too close meant I'd have to actually do something about it. She asked me, too, what I remembered of Holt from before, whether he'd always had this in him, or whether something had changed him along the way. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know, that the brotherhood taught me to drive stick on Sunday mornings, and the man who'd left me to take the fall for his own theft felt, some days, like two entirely different people occupying the same body. And I'd long since stopped trying to reconcile them into a single coherent person I could either forgive or condemn cleanly. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone said to me in months, she said quietly. She didn't cry. She just folded the folder shut, said, I want to help you fix this, and walked back toward her car with her shoulders set in a way that told me she meant it. Odell Sharp's office sat above a hardware store on Corbett Street. A narrow flight of stairs leading up to 2 rooms lined floor to ceiling with case files. A consumer protection attorney who'd made a career out of exactly this kind of quiet provincial theft. The kind that hides behind respectability, behind flower arrangements and hospice galas and a family name 3 generations deep in a small town's trust. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with the unhurried patience of someone who'd learned early that these cases were won on documentation, not outrage. I laid it all out for him. The 9,450 Okafor withdrawal from 14 years ago. Emmett's confirmation that the pattern had continued into the present. The letters. The retouched photograph. The loan fake had unknowingly co-signed against a building that wasn't fully my mother's to leverage. He took notes in a cramped, efficient shorthand, occasionally asking me to slow down and repeat a date or a dollar figure, and only once did he set his pen down entirely. When I described Emmett's ledger showing entries 8 months old. Say that part again, he said. The recent entries. You're certain those postdate anything you found at 20. Emmett showed them to me himself. Different account numbers, smaller amounts, but the same handwriting pattern in the corrections column. It's still happening. Sharp listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he didn't reach for outrage. He reached for a phone. This stopped being a family matter the moment you told me it was still happening, he said. I want to be very clear with you about what you're actually looking at here, Ren, because I don't think anyone in your family has ever said it to you plainly. Pre-need funeral trust fraud is a state-regulated offense. Real victims, real families who paid in good faith for the one thing they thought they'd never have to worry about again. A dignified burial they wouldn't have to scramble to afford while they were grieving somebody they loved. What your mother and your brother did isn't a family disagreement I can help you mediate. It's a crime with 30-some names attached to it that neither of us knows yet. I need to bring in someone from the state's Fraud Investigation Division. Her name is Bianca Whitlock. She's handled 3 trust fraud cases in this region in the last 5 years, and I've never seen her lose one. What happens to the families in the meantime? I asked. The ones who don't know yet that their money might not be there. That's exactly why we move fast, he said. Every week this stays quiet is another week. Someone in this town might die, not knowing their family is about to discover the funeral they already paid for isn't fully funded. I'm not going to sugarcoat that for you. This needs to move, and it needs to move now, and it's going to be ugly for your family before it gets better for everyone else's. Bianca arrived within the week, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of investigator who asked one precise question and then simply waited, letting silence do the work most people rush to fill with confessions. She set up in a rented conference room at the county courthouse, rather than Sharp's office, telling me plainly on the first day that she preferred neutral ground for interviews, and spent the better part of 2 weeks working through Emmett's ledgers, line by line with a forensic accountant flown in from the state capitol. Within days of reviewing the documentation Emmett had finally, fully turned over, she confirmed what he'd told me in fragments. The diversions weren't isolated to Okafor's account or to the handful of files I'd stumbled across at 20. There were 31 separate families across 14 years. Funds pulled in small, patchable amounts and partially replenished only when new client deposits came in. The exact mechanics of a shell game, timed carefully enough that no single-family shortfall ever surfaced during the actual funeral they'd paid for. Bianca called it rolling coverage the first time she explained it to me. Tracing the pattern across a whiteboard with a dry erase marker, red lines connecting one family's diverted funds to the deposit that had quietly refilled the hole 2 months later, over and over. A structure that only worked as long as new grieving families kept walking through Ashcomb's doors, trusting the name on the sign. Bianca called it rolling coverage the first time she explained it to me. Tracing the pattern across a whiteboard with a dry erase marker, red lines connecting one family's diverted funds to the deposit that had quietly refilled the hole 2 months later, over and over. A structure that only worked as long as new grieving families kept walking through Ashcomb's doors, trusting the name on the sign. Holmes. She walked me through 3 separate years of the pattern that afternoon, pointing out where the timing had gotten tighter as the scheme matured. Early diversions replenished within weeks. Later ones stretched to nearly 2 months before a new deposit closed the gap, a widening margin that told her, she said, that whoever was managing the shell game had grown more confident, or more desperate, or possibly both at once. This is one of the more organized versions of this scheme I've seen, she told me, not unkindly, closing her laptop after a long afternoon of cross-referencing bank records. Which tells me somebody involved is smart enough to know exactly what they're doing and disciplined enough to keep doing it for 14 years without slipping. That's rarer than you'd think. Most people who do this get greedy and get caught in year 2 or 3. I sat in on 3 of her family interviews that week, at Bianca's invitation, since several of the families had specifically asked whether the Ashcombe daughter would be involved in the case, a strange kind of trust to be handed. Considering how thoroughly this town had once been told I wasn't to be trusted with anything at all. A retired school teacher named Odette Pruitt sat across from Bianca with her late husband's funeral folder in her lap, describing, in a voice that stayed admirably level, how she'd paid $6,200 into a trust account 9 years earlier specifically so her children wouldn't have to scramble for funds while they were grieving. And how she'd never once thought to question whether that money had actually stayed where she'd put it. You trust a name like Ashcombe, she said, not looking at me when she said it, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. You don't think to ask a family that's buried 3 generations of your own family whether they're stealing from you. I didn't have an answer for her. I don't think there was one that would have helped. My mother, sensing the walls tightening, made her move 2 weeks later. A second gala, smaller than the first, hastily assembled under the banner of a family reunited, complete with a florist's arch of white roses at the entrance and a photographer she'd hired specifically, I later learned, to capture the reconciliation for the local paper. She'd called me herself to ask me to attend, her voice warm and pleading in a register I hadn't heard directed at me since childhood, framing it as a chance to show this town we're still a family. And I'd agreed to come only because Sharp and Bianca both told me it might be useful. That a mother confident enough to stage a public reconciliation was a mother who hadn't yet realized how much of her own paperwork was already sitting in a state investigator's briefcase. It would mean everything to me, she'd said on the phone. And I remember standing in that motel room listening to her and thinking how strange it was that, after 14 years of silence, the first thing she wanted from me wasn't an apology or an explanation, but a performance. One more piece of stagecraft to keep the story running a little longer. She met me at the door, with tears already staged in her eyes, and pulled me into an embrace in front of 30 guests, murmuring my daughter, loud enough for the cameras to catch it, performing a warmth she had never once offered me in private. She'd dressed me, practically, a dress she'd had delivered to the guest suite that morning, cream-colored, for the photos, and I'd worn it anyway, understanding by then that letting her build the stage exactly the way she wanted was the fastest way to make sure the collapse, when it came, would be complete. I remember standing in front of the mirror in that guest suite an hour before the gala, wearing a dress my mother had chosen for a role she'd assigned me without asking, and thinking that this was, in its own strange way, the last performance either of us would ever give together. One final scene staged entirely on her terms, before the terms themselves changed for good. Bianca Whitlock walked through that same door, 20 minutes later, flanked by 2 officers, holding a subpoena for every trust account record Ashcombe Family Funeral Home had generated in the last 14 years. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room did that for her, 30 conversations dying in a ragged wave as guests turned to watch a state investigator hand a folded document to a woman still holding a champagne flute in a cream-colored dress that matched her daughter's, under an arch of white roses that had cost, I would later learn from the florist's invoice, $3 my mother didn't actually have to spare. My mother's carefully rehearsed warmth froze mid-expression, caught permanently on a dozen phones and one very unfortunate newspaper photographer, on faces that had shown up expecting a fairy tale ending, and instead witnessed the exact moment the story my mother had spent a lifetime writing finally ran out of pages. Marguerite Ashcombe, Bianca said, her voice carrying just far enough. I have here a subpoena for the complete preneed trust records of Ashcombe Family Funeral Home, effective immediately. I'd recommend you contact counsel before you say anything further to anyone in this room. The formal audit took 3 months. When it finished, it confirmed the full shape of what 14 years had actually cost. 214,760 diverted from 31 grieving families, replenished only in fragments, patched together by Emmett's increasingly desperate bookkeeping and my mother's willful, unbroken silence. Holt's gambling debts, traced back through casino records and 2 separate high-interest personal loans, totaling nearly $80,000 by themselves, sat at the center of it. But it was Marguerite's complicity, her decision, 14 years ago, to protect her son by erasing her daughter, instead of reporting a crime, that the state board found hardest to process into any language that wasn't simply cruelty. The final report ran to 112 pages, and I read every one of them the night Sharp's office sent them over, sitting alone in a motel room 3 miles outside town, because I hadn't been able to make myself stay under my mother's roof past the day the subpoena was served. I remember sitting on the edge of that motel bed at nearly 2 in the morning, the report spread across the bedspread in loose pages, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even relief, but a strange, quiet grief for the version of my mother I'd spent my whole childhood believing existed underneath the difficult one. Somewhere around page 80, reading a spreadsheet of dates that lined up almost exactly with birthdays and anniversaries, I remembered her marking with real warmth. I understood that grief and clarity could occupy the same body at the same time without canceling each other out. I let myself feel both, that night, for as long as they needed, and then I folded the report closed and slept better than I had in 14 years. Holt was arrested outside the courthouse the day of his hearing, led out in handcuffs past a crowd of Millhaven Falls residents, who had once trusted him to bury their parents with dignity, some of whom I recognized as families whose names I'd read in Emmett's ledger. Nobody shouted anything. Small towns don't, usually. They just watched, quiet and stone-faced, the particular silence of people recalculating an entire relationship with a family name in real time. My mother took the stand 2 days later, under oath, in a navy suit that made her look exactly as composed as she'd looked in every gala photograph for 14 years. She answered the preliminary questions smoothly, her voice level, her hands folded, decades of practiced composure holding steady under a kind of pressure I'd never once seen crack her in my entire childhood. Odell Sharp let her get comfortable in that composure before Sharkey asked her the one question, plainly, without theater. Mrs. Ashcombe, you discovered the trust discrepancies 14 years ago, when your daughter first brought them to your attention. You chose at that time to remove her from this family rather than report the crime. My question is simple. Why did you let your daughter be blamed instead of your son? She opened her mouth. Nothing came. I watched her search for the version of the story that had always worked before. The deflection, the old grievance, the smooth pivot to a subject she could control, and find, for the first time in 14 years, that there wasn't one available. Not under oath. Not with Emmett's ledger already entered into evidence, and 31 families' names already a matter of public record. The silence in that courtroom lasted longer than the one that had followed Pike's question on her own porch months earlier. And this time there was no caterer's tray to break it, no smooth story waiting in the wings to rescue her. She simply sat there, and the truth sat there with her, and for the first time in 14 years, nobody in the room was willing to let her look away from it. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later included victim impact statements from 6 of the 31 families, read aloud in a courtroom that had gone stiff and silent in a way I'd never experienced before, not even in a cockpit taking fire. Odette Pruitt stood and read a single page in a voice that only wavered once, near the end, when she described opening the accounting report Bianca's office had mailed her and seeing her late husband's name printed next to a dollar figure that no longer matched what she'd paid in. a younger man named Desmond Caro. No relation to Pike, a coincidence that struck me as strange when the clerk read his name. Spoke about burying his mother 8 months earlier and only now learning that a third of what he'd paid toward her service had been quietly diverted the same month he'd paid it. A third family, the Bellwethers, sent their daughter to read on their behalf because her parents, both in their 80s, said they couldn't trust their voices to hold. She read it anyway, steady and clear, describing a trust account opened the year her grandfather passed, meant to spare her parents exactly this kind of stress in their own old age, and how strange it felt to learn the very institution meant to protect them from financial hardship during grief had instead manufactured it. Emmett sat in the gallery through all of it, his hands folded in his lap, and I watched him flinch physically at every name. Bangram. Bianca testified last, laying out the mechanics of the scheme in plain, procedural language that somehow landed harder than any of the emotional testimony that preceded it. The rolling coverage, the 14 years of documented withdrawals, the 8 months of continued activity, even after I had first confronted my mother about it at 20. When Sharp asked her, for the record, whether in her professional opinion the scheme could have continued indefinitely had it not been interrupted, she answered without hesitation. Yes. There's no indication in 14 years of records that this would have stopped on its own. It stopped because Captain Ashcombe made it stop. In the months that followed, Holt was convicted on multiple counts of trust fraud and ordered to pay restitution to all 31 families, a sentence that would take him the better part of a decade, to satisfy even with the funeral home's remaining assets liquidated to help cover it. He served 18 months at a minimum security facility 2 hours from Millhaven Falls, and I visited exactly once, mostly to look at the man across the table and confirm to myself that I felt nothing I needed to apologize for feeling. He looked smaller across that visitation table than he had in the study that afternoon, and for a moment I remembered the version of him who used to let me ride shotgun on Sunday mornings. Before I made myself stop remembering that version and see the one actually sitting in front of me. He asked, near the end of the visit, whether I thought our mother would ever forgive herself, and I told him honestly that I didn't think forgiveness was the right question for either of them to be asking yet. That restitution came first, and self-forgiveness, if it came at all, would have to earn its place a long way behind it. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I think some small, honest part of him understood he hadn't earned the standing to ask. My mother faced separate charges for her role in the cover-up and permanently lost her funeral director's license, the credential her own mother had earned before her, the one she'd built an entire identity around protecting at any cost. The state board's ruling was unambiguous. Willful concealment of trust fraud, obstruction of a family member's attempt to report it, 14 years of documented silence. And she did not contest it. Perhaps because by then even she understood there was no version of the story left to tell that anyone in Millhaven Falls would believe. She avoided prison time through a plea agreement that required full cooperation with the restitution process, community service at the county courthouse of all places, and 5 years of probation. Sharp told me later that, during the plea negotiations, her attorney had tried floating a version of events where she'd only recently discovered Holt's activity. And the negotiation had collapsed within the hour once Sharp produced my original account of the confrontation from 14 years earlier, corroborated independently by Emmett's ledgers. There was, in the end, no story small enough to survive that much documentation. A fact I found myself thinking about more than once in the weeks that followed. How a woman who had spent 30 years mastering the art of the smooth, convincing story had finally run into the one audience a good story has never been able to fool. A stack of dated bank records that don't care how composed you look while you're explaining them away. I heard secondhand that she sold the house on the circular drive within the year and moved 2 counties over to a town where nobody yet knew the name Ashcombe well enough to flinch at it. Emmett Truro cooperated fully once the audit confirmed what he'd already admitted to me in his office and received a reduced sentence, 8 months, suspended pending continued cooperation, in exchange for the full unredacted ledgers that let Bianca's team trace every diverted dollar back to its rightful family. He wrote me a letter afterward, the kind of letter that arrives on actual paper instead of a screen, apologizing for 14 years of silence. He said he'd tell himself was loyalty when it was really just cowardice with better bookkeeping. He mentioned, near the end of it, that he'd started keeping the accounts for a small nonprofit that helped elderly residents navigate exactly this kind of financial paperwork, as though he needed somewhere honest to put his particular set of skills after 14 years of using them the other way. He also included, folded separately inside the envelope, a photocopy of the very first page he'd ever entered a suspicious withdrawal onto 14 years earlier. The original evidence, preserved all this time that same locked drawer, as though some part of him had always known it would eventually matter to someone. I didn't write back right away. I'm still deciding what I think I owe a man who finally told the truth only after I'd already found it myself, though I'll admit the nonprofit detail moved me more than I expected it to. The 31 families received both restitution and a public accounting of exactly what had happened to the money they'd trusted to a name they thought they knew. Bianca's office mailed each family a full breakdown of their account's history, dollar by dollar, alongside the restitution checks. And I sat in on 2 of the community meetings that followed, watching people I'd known my entire childhood ask quiet, careful questions about money they'd set aside for their own funerals 15 years earlier. Some of them thanked me directly, which felt strange to receive, since I hadn't done anything more than refuse to keep forgetting what I'd once been told to forget. Others simply nodded when they saw me, a small, wordless acknowledgement that seemed to carry more weight than any thank you could have. It wasn't only the dollars that mattered to most of them, I learned. It was the accounting itself, the plain, documented truth of it, restoring something the fraud had quietly stolen alongside their money, their faith in the one ritual meant to honor the people they'd lost. Mrs. Okafor, Bertram's widow, found me after one of those meetings and held both my hands for a long moment, without saying anything at all. And I understood that as its own kind of thank you, the kind that doesn't need words to land. I never rebuilt anything with my mother. We spoke exactly once more after the plea agreement was finalized, a short, stilted phone call in which she asked if I'd consider visiting once she'd resettled. And I told her as gently as I could manage that some walls, once you understand exactly what they were built to protect, aren't worth the labor of tearing back down. She didn't argue. I think by then, even she had run out of arguments worth making. But I stood 4 months later, in my dress uniform at the Millhaven Falls Town Hall, on a cold, bright Saturday morning with the kind of clear sky that made the whole county look freshly rinsed, when the community announced the new trust board that would oversee every pre-need account the funeral home's new ownership managed going forward. An oversight structure with actual outside auditors, actual families on its board, quarterly public statements, the kind of accountability that should have existed all along and never once had. The town hall itself had been decorated simply. None of the staged white roses or hired photographers my mother had once favored. Just folding chairs set out in rows, a podium with a hand-lettered banner reading Millhaven Falls Pre-Need Trust Board, and a table near the entrance where the new trust documents sat available for any resident who wanted to read exactly how the safeguards would work. It was, I thought, standing at the back of the room before the ceremonies began. The most honest piece of civic architecture Millhaven Falls had built in 14 years. Nothing dressed up, nothing hidden, just a plain accounting of what would happen to people's money, and who would be watching to make sure it stayed where it belonged. The funeral home itself had new ownership by then, a couple from 2 towns over with no history in Millhaven Falls to protect and nothing to hide. And their first act as new proprietors had been to invite the very families Holt and my mother had defrauded to help design the safeguards that would keep it from ever happening again. Colonel Pike stood beside me in his own dress uniform, the ceremony for my Distinguished Flying Cross, finally rescheduled and folded quietly into the same trip out east. A small irony neither of us mentioned out loud but both understood. The award that had first cracked my mother's story open, finally being given its due in the very town that story had tried to erase me from. He caught me looking at the restored portrait a second time before the ceremony started and stepped up beside me, without a word for a moment, the 2 of us just looking at it together. "For what it's worth," he said finally. "I almost didn't say anything to you at all that night. I told myself it wasn't my business, that whatever was going on in that house was a family matter I should stay out of. I'm glad I called anyway. Me too, I said, and meant it more than I knew how to say out loud in a lobby full of people waiting for a ceremony to start. Sable stood in the crowd with a bouquet of white peonies she'd cut that morning specifically for the occasion, the same flower she'd been arranging in that shop window since we were 15. She caught my eye across the room and mouthed something I didn't need to hear to understand. Something between, "I'm proud of you," and "I told you so," the particular combination only a childhood best friend can pull off without either half sounding unkind. Faye stood beside her, no longer married to a man in a courtroom jumpsuit, rebuilding a life on terms that were finally entirely her own. Her daughter's community college tuition secured through a settlement that hadn't required her to lose everything for a crime she hadn't committed. The two of them had become unlikely friends over the preceding months, bonded by the strange particular intimacy of having both loved people connected to the same unraveling family. Faye's daughter had even started stopping by Griggs and Bloom after school some afternoons, learning to arrange flowers the same way I once had, a small, unplanned continuity that neither of them had set out to build, but both seemed grateful for anyway. Someone from the town committee had found the original family portrait among the trust board's paperwork. Emmett, it turned out, had kept a copy filed away for years in the same locked drawer, the same uncropped image Sable had carried in a shoebox for over a decade, and they hung it, unprompted, in the town hall lobby beside a plaque listing the new board's members. All four of us, exactly as we'd been photographed at 15. No urn of dried hydrangeas standing in for a daughter. No careful seam of retouching hiding where I used to belong. Nobody asked my permission to hang it there. Nobody needed to. It was simply, finally, allowed to be true again, in a building where mourners would pass beneath it for years to come, none of them ever again wondering who the fourth person in the frame had been. I stood in front of it for a long moment before the ceremony started, close enough to see the small imperfections a 14-year-old print carries. A slight crease in one corner, the faded color of a decade spent in a shoebox, marked for shoes it had never actually held, and thought about how strange it was that the truest version of my family had survived, all this time, not in the house built to represent us, but in a repurposed cardboard box on a shelf behind a flower shop, kept safe by someone who owed me nothing but chose to keep it anyway. I thought, too, about Bertram Okafor, a man I'd never actually met, whose name had started this entire unraveling 14 years before I understood what I was even looking at, and about Odette Pruitt reading her statement in a courtroom without her voice ever quite breaking, and about the Bellwether's daughter, reading a page her own parents couldn't bring themselves to read aloud. Somewhere in all of it, a story that had started as mine alone had become something considerably larger, 31 families worth of larger. And I understood finally that fixing it had never really been about me getting my name back into a hallway gallery. It had been about making sure the next family who walked through Ashcombe's doors could trust the promise on the brass plaque without checking twice. I didn't cry standing in front of that photograph, though I'd expected to. What I felt instead was quieter than that. Something closer to the particular stillness you feel after a long flight, engines finally cut, rotors spinning down, the world settling back into a silence that isn't empty anymore. I never vanished. I was just the only person for 14 years who knew that, for certain, carrying it alone the way you carry altitude sickness quietly, without complaint, because complaining had never once gotten me believed. It turns out the truth doesn't actually need to be loud to be owed to someone. It only needs, eventually, someone willing to listen, a colonel on a porch, a florist with a shoebox, a room full of strangers who'd once trusted a name and were brave enough to keep believing in something better once that name had failed them. For the first time since I was 20 years old, an entire town finally was listening, and I intend to spend considerably less than 14 more years taking that kind of thing for granted. So here's the answer. The one I promised you at the start, sitting on that tailgate at Fort Colby, wondering if I even had it in me to find out. Yes, I walked back through that door. Not because the family that erased me deserved a second chance. Most days, I still don't think they did. But because 31 families who'd never erased anyone deserved someone willing to walk through it and finally tell them the truth. If you'd asked me the night I got that voicemail whether I'd still be standing in Millhaven Falls, 4 months later, in dress uniform, watching my own face get hung back on a wall it should never have left, I would have told you that seemed like a different life entirely. It wasn't. It was just the rest of the same one, finally allowed to continue honestly. If you want to see how far one family will go to protect a lie they told themselves was necessary, the story waiting for you next is one of the most watched reckonings this channel has ever told. And it starts exactly the way mine did, with someone who thought they'd already found the bottom of the truth, only to discover they hadn't even come close.